Still good?
Yeah.
All right, cool. Let's get moving then. All right, so we're talking about women and economic development. We're going to take sort of a historical aspect of it, but we're kind of going to mostly focus on what's happening today and how everything that happened historically affects us today. A couple key words, but we don't really got to worry about that too much. First, we start with a tweet. This happened at the beginning of the month. Burger King UK, women belong in the kitchen. What sort of reception do you think that got from the internet?
Bad reception because it's saying that people are going to expect it to mean that women belong in the kitchen, that they shouldn't be working.
Sure. Where does that idea come from? Where does that sentiment come from? Why is that such a shocking thing? Sure, absolutely, right? And to say this now, what do you think the purpose of that was? Let's go over here.
Well, I know the purpose of that was that they were trying to do something about like getting more women jobs, but the fact that they did this first is really insensitive and stupid on their part.
I agree. Yeah, and you were right. That is if y'all, any of y'all had actually seen it, right? If they want to, of course. Only 20% of chefs are women. We're on a mission to change the gender ratio in the restaurant industry by empowering female employees with the opportunity to pursue a culinary career. Right. So the intent was a good thing, right? They wanted to help women start their careers in the culinary industry. Unfortunately, they went about it the wrong way. Right. And we're going to sort of see this idea of using this sort of shock value and where this shock value comes from and why it's shocking today, right? We've essentially came so far that seeing something like this is absolutely shocking to a lot of people. All right, so let's start historically, right? We're talking about the development of women, and really, unfortunately, we have to start with the development of gendered roles in society, right? Before the agricultural revolution, most roles were pretty equal, right? We have sort of evidence to show that a lot of the bones pre-agricultural revolution dealt with a lot of the same sort of blows, like breaks, fractures. They have the same sort of things happening between men, women, and children, right? So that basically lets us know that women were also part of the hunt. Women were part of everything. I'll let y'all get your notes out. So we're showing, right, that women were equal parts of everything going on. It wasn't until the birth of the agricultural revolution that we start to see these gendered roles take place. Now, why do y'all think that gendered roles started happening after the agricultural revolution? What do you think led to them starting to separate work between men and women? What were they doing before the agricultural revolution? How were they getting their food before then?
They were hunting.
Hunting, yeah. That was like primarily their food source, right? And they didn't have a variety of food sources, right? It was a very plain food source. Maybe 1-2 sorts of agricultural things that grew in their area, and then mostly meat, right? Mostly hunting. After, we see a couple of reasons why these societies started developing these gendered roles. One of them being socially, right? As we start agriculture, we are able to build bigger civilizations, bigger groups of people. That means 2 things for women particularly, right? That means that they're having more children, right? Because they have food to sustain themselves. And it also means that there's more farming to be done, meaning that we're developing new tools. And a lot of these newer tools required a bigger build to work them. Now that would be more biologically, I guess. Another social factor, right? Another social factor affecting like women's roles is the development of these big societies. We also have really an increase in the amount of war happening, right? More tribes are going up against each other, pitting each other up against for land use, and that sort of puts a man in a position to protect, right? As the protector of the family, protector of the home base. And then finally, another biological reason really is that because women are having more children, they're less capable of working as often, right? Because they're having many kids, obviously not at once, but they're having many kids all together. So they are not given as tough work. And so from the very inception of these early civilizations, we see, right, how these gender roles start to aggregate, and more, it just starts to get worse and worse. Now, as we'll see a little later, right, these start to kind of worsen through these higher societies, right? I talked about this last week where we sort of put famous people, rich people on this sort of pedestal, and we want to see what they're eating, see what they're doing, see what they're writing, what they're buying. That's been happening for the longest time, right? And we'll see how women who are essentially taken care of get these sort of roles. Does anyone know what these shoes here are? Has anyone ever seen something like that?
It's because some, I don't know who it was, but it was some person in the place of power in an Asian country, I believe, and this wife that he had was born with a clubbed foot, and he made it a requirement, or it became a trend for women to have clubbed feet so that they could give themselves a more like delicate.
Well, it may have started with the club foot, but because she was in a position of power, it began to be seen as this sort of really beautiful thing. Okay, the women in power don't have to work as much, right? They shouldn't be walking, let alone working, right? So these are an adult woman's feet. If you guys have ever heard of foot binding, it is, I don't even want to show y'all the actual picture of her without the socks on. There is a picture if you ever do want to see it. But this is an adult woman's foot. Think of your foot doing literally that. And then just sticking it into a glove, right? In this case, a tiny little shoe. In China, right? This is where this was happening. So, again, we do random things for beauty. What do we do today, right? That really is somewhat seemingly painful. But what do y'all do? What do women do particularly today that hurts them, but is sort of seen as beauty? Plastic surgery is a good one.
Waxing their nails.
What was that? Waxing. Anyone ever spend a day in stilettos or high heels? Right. A lot of women have. Yeah. Oh, so you know the pain.
No, actually.
Then you know the pain. You know it's not fun, right?
Some people use corsets to make their waist skinny.
Nice corsets, and then a lot of y'all have your ears pierced too, right? Y'all are puncturing holes in your body. At this point, it's kind of customary, right? But certainly you can add some jewelry in there. All right, quick question for you guys. Let me find this. Are women considered minorities? Across the world. Let's think U.S. Let's think in the U.S.
I was gonna ask, do you mean as in today or at that time?
Oh yeah, today.
Okay.
What do y'all think? Yes, no? We're waiting on two more responses, basically. Oh, we have a pretty, let's see what this last person says. Pretty even here. Not too even. Yeah, wow. Okay. So what do y'all think? Are women minorities or not?
No.
Why not?
Well, because they're half of the population, so.
Okay. What about, does anybody else disagree? Do you think women are minorities? Some of y'all put yes. Most of y'all put yes. So, on paper, women are not minorities technically, like you mentioned. They are half the population. But historically, they have been underrepresented, right? They have been historically mistreated. And so a lot of protections are put in place for women, as we'll see a little bit later in the slides. A lot of protections are put up for women to help them sort of get to the point where they should have been hundreds of thousands of years ago, right? So we'll see sort of these protections apply to women as well as minorities, right? So they sort of are oftentimes lumped in with minorities because of that historic mistreatment. All right, so the cult of domesticity. This is kind of where we see the inception. Cult also just means culture, not like a cult, but that's where the word does come from. So the cult of domesticity. This is where we see sort of the inception of the sentiment, like we saw with that Burger King thing, right? Women belong in the kitchen. This is kind of where it comes from. This is the birth of that, at least in the Western world, in the United States and Britain. So what is it exactly? Right? It's this development and sentiment, particularly from the higher class women, that they should share sort of four major traits. The four traits, as we see here, right? Piety, purity, domesticity, and submissiveness. For those that don't know what piety means, it pretty much just means being devout, being religiously devout, right? those end up becoming the conduct that is expected of women throughout the rest of time, up until really today. We've come and made huge leaps and bounds, right? But this is the birth of it, right? You see this lady's book, right? So you see sort of the influence of media and what it has on people's perceptions, right? Today you can see it very clearly in social media. But back then the main media was print media, right? So this sort of monthly magazine would come out, sort of like an article of periodicals. Every month they would come out, and they were good and bad things to these ideas, right? A lot of these middle class and high class women were educated, well educated, mostly because they were put in charge to teach the children. They would teach them politics, and a lot of the children they would teach would essentially become the sort of high class members and men of the society. So the high class women were actually very well educated, and the author of this book actually was a proponent of high class women, high class education, and actually helped sort of develop this idea of educating women. So it's sort of a good thing in a way, but again, the only people that are caring to get educated at this point are going to be middle class and high class women. Work was never really an option for poor women. They've been working the whole time. They're either working as maids, working in the fields, right, doing threading, right, working in the textile industry. This was never an option for them, basically. But what this did do is it essentially created this aura of women should be dressing a certain way, right? In the articles, they would have different sorts of dresses, what to cook, recipes. But again, it also had good things, right? Edgar Allan Poe, who's a really famous author, had a lot of his work published in these books. A lot of famous authors were published in these books. So it kind of is this weird balance. But these ideas stayed for so long that they end up becoming, in the long run, poisonous to our society, particularly on how we observe and how we see women. We sort of exalt them, right, for having these virtues. Now, keep this in mind, another thing, right? What this sort of cult of domesticity also does is it puts a woman in a place of moral authority. Keep that in mind. Moral authority of the household, right? And I think that's going to play a big role in what women end up getting into as the years progress. Which one of them being reform movements, right? This is essentially how women start coming together. They use their moral influence. They say, I shouldn't just be the moral influence of my household. We should be the moral influence of the nation, right? And so they start these reform movements, starting really with the abolitionist movement, right? And we'll see that mostly from Quakers. They were like staunch critics of slavery from the very early inception of the United States. And even Elizabeth Cady Stanton, as you see there, she was also a huge proponent. And so we see these women coming together. Now, of course, at this time, many women were not kind of critics of civil rights, basically. But that didn't matter because there was a lot of other reform movements. I know you guys, I'm sure you've heard at some point maybe scary stories when they talk about insane asylums. And certainly around that time, insane asylums were probably underfunded. The science was not there for us to understand how to help people. But the fact that these women got together to build these asylums was a huge deal for everyone, right? Before then, I mean, we essentially let people die out. And that was like our solution to mental health issues. And so really these two women, there's hundreds of thousands of women, but these two women join and they create what's called the Seneca Falls Convention, the first female rights convention. This is like the birth of the female rights movement. We'll see it sort of spring up again around World War II, and then we see it spring up again around the 1960s. Right? But this is where it all starts, right? They have these wild, crazy ideas, right, that women should be able to vote, women should have autonomy over the things that they own, right? Because at this point, they are essentially seen as property. They are as good as property at this point. So they have these wild ideas of female empowerment, and it really just takes them coming together, making a huge movement, right? They write out sort of like a faux Declaration of Independence for women. What we deserve, how we shouldn't be getting treated. And it really sparks this sort of movement that unfortunately kind of gets messed up during the Civil War. You see, it's like we're right before the Civil War. So it sort of kind of starts to fall apart at the Civil War. And then around the 1920s, we get suffrage, right? We get the right to vote. Women's suffrage is accomplished. But did it really change anything? They get a right to vote, and really not all women, right? Just probably rich, middle, high class women get the right to vote, or at least everyone gets the right to vote. But whether or not they're allowed, they can pass certain exams to get to the voting bowl. Whether they can even get off of work if they're poor to get to the voting. Right. So then we see World War II. We see this spring up again. We see this huge movement, right? We have hundreds of thousands of men leaving for war. And now we have this huge influx of necessity, right? We need to build ships. We need to build airplanes now. We need to build armor. We need to build ammunition, right? We have all these factories that are losing money and they're in need of power, right? Manpower, in this case, female power, right? Does anybody know who this person is right here? Nice. Yeah, Rosie the Riveter. Right, and if you guys know what like riveting is, it's literally when they would like put giant machines together, they're essentially like the screws that go inside of these airplanes to keep them together. And this was seen as a man's job. This was seen as a tough, greasy, dirty job. And now we're seeing, right, the actual government had to go to really huge lengths to spew out propaganda to get these factories to even hire women, right? They didn't even want to hire the women. They were at one point considering child labor again, rather than hiring women, right? So that's absolutely insane. And certainly they showed, right? They showed that they're more than capable of producing the same quality of work and at the same speed, right? And as we also see, right, many joined the actual army too, right? This is where we start letting women into the army. Certainly not into combat, right? Why not? But the actual quote, right? Free a man up to fight. So these women would come into the military and they would be given positions of like clerks. They would be doing like radio broadcasting, mostly to allow more men to go into combat. Yeah.
Would they be like nurses while in battle or?
Absolutely. They would never. Well, They would never have the tents too close to the battle, but they were certainly plenty of nurses that came out. And we'll also see. Good question. Like we'll have. Really the rise of nursing, the rise of the Red Cross, the rise of really female-run industry, right? Not necessarily just healthcare, but nursing in particular. And we'll kind of see that in a little bit too. All right. What do you think happened to women in the workforce after the war? What happened to them? Were they allowed to keep their jobs? Were they promoted? Most of you are getting it. Mario. One more? Alright. So, they were forced to quit, right? They were either forced to quit or fired. And this hurt a lot of really poor women, right? Because they were given an opportunity to work in a factory which paid them way more than they had been paid before that, right? So they were given awesome work. Now, were they getting paid as much as men? Heck nah. Why would I do that? Right? It's still legal, right, for me to discriminate against women, for me to pay them less than I would pay a man. So not only were they getting paid less, but they were also constantly being harassed at work, like, by their bosses. So it's essentially just the worst position to be in. And then the men come back after war, they're thinking, hey, we've showed all the work that we can do. Nah, quit or fired. All right, so again, as we mentioned, right, the fight for minorities sort of goes hand in hand with the fight for women. Even though women are technically not minorities, their plight is just as hurtful, right? Their plight is just as tough that they've had to sort of get to. So we'll see right in the Civil Rights Act the difficulty it was, right? And we talked about this 4 weeks ago when we talked about redlining, how difficult it was to get housing, to get all these things. And now, primarily due to, right, to there being discrimination, right? Being the legality of discrimination. So we see the Civil Rights Act happen, and now people are sort of more allowed, right? On paper, it's illegal to discriminate, not only against race, but now against sex. So now women are essentially allowed to get the work that they want. Whether or not they're going to get hired is, it's up to the culture of men, right? It's up to the culture of the, what we call patriarchy, right? Does anyone know what like a patriarchy means? I'm sure you've heard it before. Patriarchy. So it just essentially means who's in power in the society, right? Patriarchy would mean man, matriarchy would be women. Right? So certainly the patriarchy of our society has kept women in submissive roles for the longest time, and then we sort of see these strides throughout history of women fighting to get to a higher position. And this is certainly one of the biggest ones. All right, just traditional careers, right? We talked a little bit about nursing and the rise of nursing. We see how, like the percentages of nurses that are women, right? 91%, 94% secretaries and administrative assistants. Another job that essentially was one of the few jobs that they were able to get, right, during the 40s and 50s. That was seen still as a female job, and unfortunately today it still is a primarily female job. Kindergarten teachers, waitresses, waiters, social work, flight attendants, right? And then we see some non-traditional careers, right? This is a big one right here, computer programming, right? Because that's the biggest industry right now, is tech industry, or at least the fastest growing industry. And if you ever go into a tech office, a woman is maybe like 1 out of like 20 men, right? It is pretty crazy. But you can almost see why a woman wouldn't want to go into that workforce. Not only because it's not necessarily because it's any harder than any other workforce, but because it is sort of just taken over by men, right? There are higher chances of you getting harassed at the job. Not that you will, but there are higher chances, right? You're the only woman in a group of 20 men, right? Imagine just one woman in this group, and then all men. I mean, it could be a bit uncomfortable. All right, what else do we see? Firefighters. Why don't we want female firefighters? Or why?
Because
They're seen as weak. Right. Why else? There's a particular reason why we wouldn't want a woman running into a burning building. Hello. Yes.
Okay, we're gonna interrupt you for a second. This is real life
It's all right.
teaching right here. Why
Yeah,
does it
it's-
happen? Oh wait, you're doing it, Lee?
Yeah, he's doing his student teacher
Oh,
observation.
well, it's live. We're gonna share it.
It's all right.
Well, welcome to education right here.
What is happening?
You see, we're just taking a random picture of you, like whatever. We are recognizing Mr. Wise because he's awesome, and just for your work with taking on the student teacher and mentoring and showing them how to be awesome in the future. So we really appreciate you.
Awesome. Well, thank you.
So you're
All
welcome.
right.
You get to take a picture. We're gonna take a picture of you. I'll warn you this time.
One, two,
Smile.
three.
All right.
Got it.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Yay, we appreciate you.
Thank you.
Bye, y'all. We gotta get a little break. All right, there you go. Back to your lesson.
All righty.
We throw you a curveball.
We'll edit that out for when we turn it in.
Why though?
Well, that was
Do
interesting.
you get a pay raise with that, or?
Yeah. No.
All right. You were about to say something. Oh, you were actually just hitting the door. I thought you were about to say something. So one reason why we wouldn't want women firefighters. Why don't we want them going into a burning building and potentially hurting themselves?
Because they're potentially hurting themselves.
Okay, well, another reason, right? Another reason why. Certainly because they're hurting themselves. But what happens if they don't make it? Who are they leaving behind?
Their family.
Family, children, right? That's still part of this aura of we want women taking care of their families.
Yeah, taking care of children.
Right, yeah, I mean, particularly if this baby is just born, right? There's certain things a mother can do that really a father can't do when we have a newborn baby. All right, let's keep moving. Gender Inequality Index. So we take 3 factors, right, for women in any country. Like say we, the UN, right? And they sort of put these numbers together in order to determine how equal the country treats the women, right? Or at least it's women, whether or not they're allowed in the workforce, right? Their reproductive health and their empowerment. Right? These are the 3 things. They kind of put them together, scramble some numbers together to see how empowering, or at least how what position a woman could get into in that country. Now, if they have, it's sort of like this scale from 0 to 1. So the 0 being super equal, 1 being absolutely unequal. Now, what we've discovered through these, right, through putting these numbers together, is that the numbers that are closer to 0, where there's more equality, they're also more developed countries. Now, why would a country be more developed if it has more equality?
Women don't have to stay at home and they can actually work.
They're working.
Their jobs.
Exactly, they're working, right? That's half the population. And in many countries, it's more than half the population. So if we allow the entire population of humans to work, then the country itself will be gaining beneficially from economy, right? Industry, everything is sort of benefiting from the entire population of people working together. Right, so keep that in mind, right? The closer to 0 that we are, the more equal. Right? Further from 0, the less equal. Now, where do you guys think the United States measures in gender inequality? Pretty high or pretty low? Pretty high. You think we're closer to 1 or closer to 0? So 0 being very equal, 1 being unequal. Closer to 0? Okay, so it is like on a very on a decimal basis. So let's check it out. Top 25 next. You guys got your notes down? I'll give you another 30 seconds. And this is sort of a map to demonstrate. I don't love the colors here, but so blue meaning better than most, red being not so great. So let's see the top 25. Switzerland, Denmark, Sweden, Netherlands, Belgium, all of these Northern European countries. Do y'all see US anywhere? Heck no. Where do you think they're at? If you had to guess a number, what number do you think they are?
0.2.
0.2. No, I mean so this is sorry, this first number is the placement. I don't know what the second number is, but the first number is where they're at placed. 46? Let's see. Ooh, right on the money!
Cheater.
Were you looking ahead?
And it was 0.2 as well.
0.2, yeah, nice. Heck yeah. Yeah, so I mean obviously we're not amazing, but it's certainly better than the next 250 countries after us. Alright. Unpaid labor. Women end up doing more work per day than men on average. Now, a lot of that work is unpaid, like what? What sort of work would be unpaid that a woman would do?
Home chores.
What is that?
Home chores.
Source?
Like hourly paid jobs, so they could be doing more in their hours.
Certainly, I mean, but that would still fall under paid work.
Oh, taking care of their kids.
Gardening? So who said gardening? Yeah, gardening and then taking care of kids, right? Sort of the same expectations that have developed from that cult of domesticity, right? Taking care of kids, doing the chores, washing dishes, keeping, making food for the husband when he gets home from work, right? So we see this growth of, the value is $10.8 trillion per year. That is a ridiculous amount of money that is not being put into our economy, only because there's no one to pay for it, really. Right? But the amount of work, and what we'll see in a little bit, right, this very famous idea of the wage gap, we'll see it here, right? It would be very different had we put a value to the work that women put in besides the paid work that they do. Alright, so we'll talk about the wage gap in a little bit, but as we said, right, it's tough for women to sort of get a footholding into the economy, and one of the ways that they do that is through what's called microcredit programs. We also see the development of these after housing, right? Housing discrimination, where a lot of minorities are not able to get loans for houses. These microcredit programs are essentially designed to help these minorities and women, right, get loans where they're mostly not going to qualify for the same loans. Now, keep in mind that these loans are technically considered untrustworthy, right? And that's purely due to speculation. It doesn't necessarily mean that they really are, right? But there's sort of this assumption that if I give a loan to someone who I'm scared will not pay it back, then I'm wasting my money, I'm throwing my money away. With these programs, the return rate on a loan is like 96%, which means 96% of the people that get a loan pay back with interest, right? That is substantial and not really risky as they sort of claim it to be. Right? So it shows that if we give people sort of an opportunity to grow, if their heart is in it, generally they're going to take it. and they're going to run with it, and they're going to succeed. So we'll see that development through these microcredit programs. Now, we get to this other idea called the wage gap. If any of you guys watch any news, you've probably heard of this idea. There's this famous saying that women get paid 79 cents to every man's dollar. There are two sort of ways to approach it, right? If we talk about unadjusted wage gap, then yes, women get paid 79 cents to the dollar. Did you see if it was?
I couldn't tell.
All right. So it's 79 cents to the dollar, right? If it's unadjusted, and basically what that means is they take all of the men that are working, all of the women that are working, and they sort of put those numbers together to see who gets paid more. Now that's unadjusted. When we adjust it, what we're doing is we're essentially taking into account, right, the type of work, the hours worked, and just off the bat, why would a woman work less hours than a man?
She has to go maternity leave.
Nice, maternity leave. And we don't generally pay for that, right? Some countries do. Some countries offer it, but we don't here. So that would be a huge reason. Nice. So that's, when we take this into account, certainly whenever we do the adjusted pay gap, it's a little better. It's not as bad as 79 cents to the dollar, but it's still not perfect, right? It's still not equal. And it pretty much also shows why America was not very high on that list of gender inequality index. All right, I think there's a way to zoom in if y'all know how to do it, so y'all can see some of these stats. Right, the purchasing power of women is unreal now. Considering where we've come from, 100 years ago, 200 years ago, women are economic powerhouses, and that's also why we associate, right, this gender inequality index with developmental countries, because obviously the more we allow women to work and figure things out for themselves economically, the more they will prove that they can. $7 trillion in spending power. It's a bunch of stimmies. All right, we'll move on. Just something to kind of look at. All right. Time to climb. Randomized answers. Let's go. All right. Go ahead and choose your player. We'll do a couple of these.
Everybody picked the giraffe.
Is that a baby? Is it like a human baby? What's the yellow one? I see a penguin and a cat. What's the yellow one? A giraffe? Oh, okay.
No, like the neon one.
There's I think that's like a baby. Like a human baby. The really bright yellow ones.
No,
Those are turtles.
Those are like turtles.
Oh. I don't
That is not a turtle.
That is definitely
we still got a few of y'all left. How many people we got? Oh, 22. Two more people. Two more.
Oh, it wasn't on the screen.
All right, let's go. All right. You want to see who got first? All right, let's see. Nice. All right, and that's pretty much it. If you guys want, y'all can click on this to sort of explore. I don't know how well y'all can see it up here. All right, but it's sort of just the UN Women's Council. They have a really good website to kind of see some of the facts and figures on at least how far we've come. And how much far we kind of still need to go sometimes. The boost to the global annual GDP by 2025 is 28 trillion if women played an identical role to men in labor markets. That's wild. This is like really in my opinion, like the more important one. Right? You're good to go. I mean, we're pretty much done here.